The Soul Winter didn't just bite, it bruised. Beverly Farrell adjusted the collar of her wool coat as the elevator of the Lotto World Tower hummed upward, a silent silver bullet ascending into the clouds. At 52, Beverly had spent 30 years in the high-octane trenches of Chicago's Level 1 trauma centers. She had seen death, she had cheated it, and she had certainly never been intimidated by it. But as the elevator door slid open directly into the private foyer of a triple-story penthouse, the cold she felt wasn't from the wind outside. It was the atmosphere of the room itself. He is difficult, Miss Farrell. Cho, the trembling representative from the Hansung Group's board of directors, whispered as he led her through the marble hallway. 10 nurses in 14 days. The last one left in tears because he threw a Lalique vase near her head. Please, you are our last resort. The shareholders are panicking. Beverly didn't slow her pace. Her sensible rubber-soled shoes, the mark of a woman who valued function over fashion, squeaked softly on the polished obsidian floors. I don't care about his vases, Mr. Cho, and I don't care about your stock prices. Is he stable? Physically, he's recovering from a grade 3 neurological event. Mentally? Cho swallowed hard, stopping before a set of towering oak doors. He is a tiger in a cage that's too small for him. Cho didn't open the door. He fled. Beverly didn't hesitate. She pushed the doors open. The master suite was a cavern of minimalist luxury. Wall-to-wall glass offered a dizzying view of the Han River, snaking through the neon-drenched veins of Seoul. In the center of the room, seated in a high-backed leather chair that looked more like a throne than a piece of furniture, was Park Yong-soo. He was a man built of sharp angles and shadows. Even at 55, and even wrapped in a charcoal silk robe that hid his surgical scars, he radiated a lethal, predatory energy. His hair was thick, obsidian streaked with silver at the temples, and his face was a masterpiece of aristocratic coldness. He didn't look at her. He was staring out at the city he owned, a glass of amber liquid. Likely tea, given his medication, though he held it like it was poison, resting in his hand. Out, he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp in Korean, then repeated in flawless, biting English. I told the board, no more nannies, no more pity. Beverly walked to the center of the room, her medical bag heavy in her hand. She didn't stop until she was 5 feet from him. I'm not a nanny, Mr. Park, and I don't have an ounce of pity in my body. It's a waste of my clinical time. Yong-soo's head turned then. It was a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes were dark, hooded, and filled with a sophisticated malice that would have sent a younger woman running for the elevator. He surveyed her, her dark skin, the graying curls pulled back into a tight, professional knot, the steady gaze of a woman who had seen the inside of a human chest and wasn't impressed by a billionaire's scowl. A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. An American. They've sent a grandmother to lecture me. He stood up, his movements stiff but practiced, hiding the weakness in his left side. He was tall, imposing even in his convalescence. He took a step toward her, invading her personal space. How much are they paying you to endure me? Whatever it is, I will double it if you walk out that door right now and never return. I'm not for sale, Beverly said, her voice like granite. Everyone is for sale, he hissed, his face inches from hers. He smelled of sandalwood and expensive bitterness. You think you're different? You think you're going to be the savior who heals the broken monster? You're a cliché, Miss Farrell, an old woman looking for a purpose in the twilight of her career. Get out of my sight before I make sure you never work in this industry again. The air in the room turned brittle. Any other person would have flinched at the sheer vitriol in his tone. Beverly didn't blink. She slowly reached down, unzipped her bag, and pulled out a blood pressure cuff and a digital thermometer. She set them on his mahogany side table with a definitive thud. First of all, Beverly said, her voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute silence. I'm 52, not dead. I have more experience in my pinky finger than the last 10 nurses you scared off combined. Second, you don't have the power to fire me. My contract is with the board, and they've given me total medical authority over this residence until you are cleared for duty. Yong-Su's eyes flared with a dangerous light. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly. A tremor he tried to hide by gripping the arm of his chair. You dare! I do dare, Beverly interrupted, stepping even closer, forcing him to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. And let's get one thing straight, Mr. Park. I'm not here to save your soul. I don't care if you're a saint or a devil, and I certainly don't care about your pain. I'm a professional. She leaned in, her voice a sharp, clinical blade. I'm not here to save you, Mr. Park. I'm here to make sure you don't die before your stock price drops. Now, sit down and give me your arm. We're checking your vitals. For the first time in his life, Park Yong-Su was speechless. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling with jagged breaths of fury, and something else. For a fleeting second, the iron wall didn't just feel like a defense. It felt like a challenge. He didn't sit, but he didn't walk away. The battle for the penthouse had begun. The following 3 days were not a recovery. They were a siege. Park Yong-Su did not fight with fists. He fought with the weapons of a man who had spent decades dismantling competitors. Psychological attrition, exhaustion, and calculated cruelty. He wanted Beverly Farrell to break. He wanted her to be the one to pack her bag and admit that he was beyond help, beyond care, and beyond her. It began with the 3 a.m. summons. Beverly was jolted from a light sleep in the guest wing by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of the internal intercom. When she entered his room, she found him sitting upright in the dark, the city lights reflecting off his sharp cheekbones like a mask of cold glass. I want juk, he said, his voice a jagged rasp. Savory rice porridge, with abalone, and it must be from a specific shop in Samcheong-dong. It's 3 in the morning, Mr. Park, Beverly said, her voice calm, though her heart was still thudding from the sudden wake-up call. The shops are closed, and abalone is too heavy for your digestive system while you're on the specific regimen of anticoagulants. Then find a way, he spat, his eyes flashing. Or is your expertise limited to bossing me around in the daylight? If I cannot eat what I want in my own home, what use are you? Beverly didn't argue. She went to the kitchen, found rice, and spent 45 minutes preparing a simplified, nutrient-dense version of the dish. When she brought it to him, he took one look at the steam rising from the bowl and swept it off the bedside table. The ceramic shattered. The porridge splattered across Beverly's shoes. I said from Samcheong-dong, he hissed. Clean it up, and don't bother sleeping. I'll likely be thirsty in an hour. Beverly looked at the mess, then up at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't yell. She simply went to the closet, got a cloth, and knelt. As she cleaned, she felt his gaze burning into the back of her head, a predator waiting for the prey to cry. She didn't cry. She counted his breaths. 22 per minute. High. He's agitated. By the second day, the attacks became personal. Tell me, Ms. Farrell, he said, as she attempted to administer his afternoon neurostimulants. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching her through narrowed eyes. Does it bother you, being a servant at your age? Back in your country, I imagine a woman like you is invisible. Here, you are merely an inconvenience. You have no husband, no children mentioned in your file, just a failing clinic and a desperate need for my company's one. Beverly reached out to take his pulse. He pulled his hand away as if her touch were acid. My personal life is not the patient's concern, she said, her voice like a steady heartbeat. What is my concern is the fact that your left hand has been trembling for the last 10 minutes, and you're trying to hide it under that cashmere throw. Yong-Su's face went rigid. The hit landed. He tucked his hand deeper into the folds of the blanket, his jaw tightening so hard she heard the bone click. I see everything, Yong-Su, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. It was a tactical strike, a breach of his formal armor. I see that you haven't slept more than 2 hours a night since I arrived. I see the way you wince when the sun hits the glass because the light triggers your migraines. You can insult my clothes, my age, and my country all you want, but I am the only person in this building who isn't afraid of your temper, and therefore, the only one who can actually see you. You see nothing, he growled, though his voice lacked its usual bite. You see a paycheck. I see a man who is terrified that if he isn't the tiger of soul, he's nothing at all. The breaking point came on the third evening. The elevator chimed, a courier delivering a locked briefcase of sensitive documents from the Hansung headquarters. Yong-soo, fueled by a mixture of pride and a refusal to be sidelined, stood up from his chair. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone, looking every bit the powerful executive, save for the slight pallor of his skin. I am going to the study, he announced. I have a merger to oversee. You aren't cleared for extended cognitive stress, and you certainly aren't cleared to walk that distance without assistance, Beverly said, stepping into his path. Move, he commanded. No, your blood pressure spiked this morning. If you sit at that desk for 4 hours, you risk a secondary event. I said, move. Yong-soo reached out, his right hand, his strong side, grabbing her shoulder to shove her aside. It was a burst of exertion his body wasn't ready for. As he tried to pivot past her, his left leg, still compromised by the neurological damage, gave way. The world tilted. His equilibrium shattered. Yong-soo braced for the humiliating impact of the marble floor. It never came. Beverly moved with the practiced, explosive grace of a nurse who had spent decades catching falling bodies. She stepped into his space, her arm hooking under his, her shoulder catching his chest. She was solid, a pillar of warm, unyielding strength. He crashed against her, his face buried in the crook of her neck. For a long, agonizing second, the silence in the penthouse was absolute. The only sound was Yong-soo's ragged, panicked breathing against her skin. He was heavy, his heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His hands, usually so controlled, were clawing at her scrubs, gripping her with a desperation that bypassed his pride. Beverly didn't push him off. She didn't mock him. She simply shifted her weight, holding him steady, her hand coming up to rest firmly on the small of his back. I've got you, she whispered. It wasn't a taunt. It was a promise. Yong-soo pulled back just enough to look at her. His hair was disheveled, falling over his eyes, and for the first time, the iron wall was gone. In its place was a raw, naked vulnerability. He was looking at her, really looking at her, not as a nurse, or an American, or an enemy. He was looking at her as a drowning man looks at the shore. His hand, still trembling, stayed on her arm. He didn't pull away. The distance between them was gone, replaced by an intensity that made the air feel thick, charged with a sudden, frightening electricity. I told you, Beverly said, her voice low and resonant. I'm not here to let you fall. Yong-soo didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply leaned into her, letting her take his weight. As the first crack in his heart began to spread, by nightfall, the sky over Seoul hadn't just turned gray. It had vanished. A Siberian front had slammed into the peninsula, burying the city in a blinding horizontal sheet of white. From the 100th floor of the Lotte World Tower, the world below, the Han River, the sprawling lights of Gangnam, the pulsing veins of traffic, was gone. They were suspended in a void. Due to the severity of the blizzard, Yong-soo had uncharacteristically dismissed the household staff early, sending them home before the mountain passes and bridges closed. Now, the sprawling 5,000-square-foot penthouse felt less like a palace and more like a silver and glass tomb. The silence was a physical weight. Beverly moved through the kitchen, the soft clack of a knife against a cutting board the only rhythm in the stillness. She was making a beef and radish soup. Sugogi muguk. Something light enough for his digestion, but heavy enough to ward off the chill seeping through the reinforced glass. She didn't ask him if he was hungry. She knew that if she asked, he would say no just to maintain the illusion of control. When the soup was done, she carried a tray toward the library. She found him sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the embers in the fireplace and the ghostly flickering white of the storm outside. He was staring at a framed photograph on his desk, an old grainy black and white image of a woman standing in front of a modest market stall. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't order her out. The fight from the previous night had drained the venom from his posture, leaving behind something far more dangerous: exhaustion. "Eat," Beverly said, setting the tray on the low table near his chair. "The ginger will help with the nausea from the new meds." "I told you I wasn't hungry," he murmured, his voice sounding thin against the howling wind. "And I told you that your opinion on your caloric intake is secondary to my medical orders," she countered, though her voice was softer than usual. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need to throw the bowl at someone. It's easier to clean the tile than the rug." She retreated, but she didn't go far. She sat in the darkened dining nook, sipping a cup of tea, watching the reflection in the glass. 10 minutes passed, then the sound of a spoon hitting ceramic. She watched his silhouette. He didn't eat like a billionaire. He ate like a man who remembered what it was to be truly hungry, efficient, focused, almost desperate. When he finished, he didn't call for her. He stayed seated, staring into the dying fire. Beverly walked back in to retrieve the tray. As she reached for the bowl, his hand shot out, not with the violence of the previous days, but with a tentative, grounding pressure, and caught her wrist. His skin was warm, his grip steady despite the tremor. "My mother sold seaweed rolls in Guangzhou Market," he said suddenly. The confession was so abrupt it felt like a physical blow. "I was 12. I watched a group of men in suits like the ones I wear now, knock her stall over because she couldn't pay for protection. They stepped on the food. They stepped on her hands." Beverly went still, her hand still hovering over the tray. She stayed quiet, knowing that for a man like Yong-Soo, silence was the only safe harbor for the truth. "I decided that day," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire, "that I would never be the person on the ground. I would be the one in the suit. I would be the one who decided who lived and who broke." He let go of her wrist, his hand falling back to his lap. "You call me cruel. You call me heartless. But heartless men do not lose their empires, Miss Farrell. They do not get stepped on." Beverly looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the silver in his hair, the fine lines of tension around his eyes that had nothing to do with his recent illness and everything to do with 30 years of holding a shield over his head. She realized then that his anger wasn't hate. It wasn't directed at her, or the board, or the nurses. It was mourning. He was mourning the boy who had loved his mother. He was mourning the man who could have been kind if the world hadn't demanded he be a monster to survive. He was terrified because this illness, this sudden physical betrayal, had stripped away the iron CEO and left only the vulnerable human underneath. "You're not in the market anymore, Yong-Soo," Beverly said, her voice a low, resonant velvet. She sat on the edge of the table, bringing herself to his eye level. "And I'm not the man in the suit coming to break your stall. I'm the woman who's going to make sure your hands are strong enough to hold whatever you want." Yong-Soo finally looked up. The firelight caught the moisture in his eyes. A glimmer. He quickly blinked away. For the first time, he didn't pull away when she reached out. She placed her hand over his trembling one, her thumb tracing the line of his knuckles. "The storm will pass," she whispered. "The storms in Seoul never truly pass," he replied, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "They just wait for you to get comfortable." But he didn't pull his hand away. He turned it over, his palm meeting hers, his fingers curling tentatively around her own. Outside, the blizzard screamed, but inside the gilded cage, the air had finally begun to warm. Beverly felt a pull in her chest, a dangerous, unprofessional spark of empathy that felt a lot like the beginning of something she couldn't control. She was 52 years old, and she knew better. but as he squeezed her hand, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the storm, the sunlight was blinding. It reflected off the fresh Seoul snow and poured through the penthouse windows with a clarity that felt invasive. Yong-soo was in his study, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of old books and unspoken secrets. He was attempting to review a digital manifest, but his left eye was twitching, a lingering ghost of his neurological event. He looked tired, not just physically, but deep in his marrow. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were slammed. Park Jin-ho, Yong-soo's brother-in-law, and the vice chairman of Hansung's construction wing marched in. He was followed by two men in identical charcoal suits carrying slim leather briefcases. Jin-ho was younger, softer, and wore a smirk that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for years. "Brother-in-law," Jin-ho said, his voice dripping with a false, oily concern. "You look frail. The rumors at the office are much kinder than the reality." Yong-soo's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "I didn't authorize a visit, Jin-ho. Get out." "I'm not here as family," Jin-ho said, signaling the lawyers. They stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the mahogany desk. "The board is concerned. The market is volatile. We need a steady hand at the helm while you play at being an invalid. These are the proxy voting rights. Sign them, and you can retire to the countryside in peace." Yong-soo stared at the papers. His tremor, the one he had worked so hard to hide from Beverly, began to vibrate through his entire arm. He tried to reach for a pen to sign, not because he wanted to, but because the shame of being seen as incapable was more painful than the loss of his company. "He isn't signing anything." The voice was like a cold snap. Every head in the room turned. Beverly stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her coat or her street clothes. She was in her deep navy scrubs, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a silver torque. She looked every inch the authority she was. Jin-ho sneered, looking her up and down. "And who is this? The help?" "I am Beverly Farrell, Mr. Park's chief medical liaison," she said, walking into the room with a stride that forced the lawyers to step back. She didn't look at Yong-soo yet. She kept her eyes locked on Jin-ho. "And you are currently in violation of a restricted medical environment." "Medical environment? This is a penthouse," Jin-ho laughed. "Move aside, woman. This is Hansung business." "It's a clinical recovery zone," Beverly corrected, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made the trauma residents in Chicago tremble. "Under the terms of my contract, which was ratified by your own board, I have the power to veto any activity that poses a direct threat to the patient's neurological stability. This," she gestured to the lawyers and the papers, "is a stress-induced stroke waiting to happen." "You have no right." "I have every right." Beverly stepped into Jin-ho's personal space. She was shorter than him, but she felt like a mountain. "Mr. Park is currently under a strict no cognitive strain protocol. These documents constitute a high-level stressor. If you don't leave this room in the next 60 seconds, I will call the police and file a report for elder abuse and corporate coercion while the patient is under medical duress. I'll also make sure the Chosun Ilbo gets a tip about how the vice chairman is trying to trigger a second stroke in his own brother-in-law." Jin-ho's face turned a mottled purple. He looked at Yong-soo, who was watching Beverly with an expression of stunned disbelief. "You're letting this foreigner speak for you?" Jin-ho spat. Yong-soo didn't answer immediately. He looked at Beverly's back, the solid, unyielding line of her shoulders. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel like he had to be the only one holding the line. "She is my medical authority," Yong-soo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Do as she says. Get out." The silence that followed was brittle. Jin-ho snatched the papers off the desk, hissed a curse in Korean, and stormed out, his legal shadows scurrying after him. The heavy doors clicked shut. The study fell into a profound quiet. Yong-soo sat back, the adrenaline leaving him all at once, leaving him gray and shaken. Beverly didn't immediately move to check his vitals. She stood by the window, watching the black sedan speed away from the tower. Why did you do that? Young-soo asked. His voice was raw. You could have let them take it. It would have made your job easier. I would have been a retired man with nothing to do but follow your orders. Beverly turned around. She saw the way he was looking at her. Not as a billionaire, but as a man who had just realized he was hunted. I'm a nurse, Young-soo. My job is to protect my patient from things that hurt them. Sometimes that's a blood clot. Sometimes it's a parasite in an expensive suit. He looked away, his jaw tight. You don't even like me. I've spent the last week treating you like an intruder. Beverly walked over to him. She didn't stay at a professional distance. She sat on the corner of his desk, looking down at him with a weary, knowing smile. I don't like bullies, she said simply. I grew up in a neighborhood where men like that took what they wanted because they thought no one was looking. I spent 30 years in an ER seeing the damage they leave behind. She reached out, and for the first time, she initiated a touch that wasn't clinical. She placed her hand over his, stilling the tremor. I don't like bullies, Young-soo, even if the person I'm protecting is a bit of a bully himself. Young-soo's fingers slowly curled around hers. He didn't let go. He looked at their joined hands. The contrast of her deep, warm skin against his pale, cool palm. It was the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to him. He had spent his whole life making sure he didn't need anyone. And yet, here he was, clinging to the hand of a woman who had just declared war on his behalf. I am a bully, he admitted, his voice a low vibration. I know, Beverly whispered, her eyes meeting his. But you're my bully. Now, let's go to the kitchen. You're going to eat, and then you're going to rest. And if I see a single business file in your hand before tomorrow, I'll hide your reading glasses. For the first time since she had arrived in Seoul, Park Young-soo didn't scowl. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible huff of a laugh. It wasn't much, but it was the sound of the ice finally, truly beginning to break. The hostility hadn't vanished. It had evolved. It was no longer a blunt instrument used to drive Beverly away, but a sharp surgical tool Young-soo used to probe the depths of the woman who had dared to claim authority over him. It began with the files. Young-soo was back at his desk, but he wasn't hiding the documents anymore. Instead, he left a quarterly report for a pharmaceutical subsidiary open on the tablet near his medication tray. When Beverly came in to check his temperature, he didn't look up. The board wants to liquidate the R&D wing in Incheon, he said, his voice casual, as if he were talking to a senior vice president rather than his nurse. They say the overhead is too high and the success rate is too low. What do you think, Miss Farrell? Beverly didn't miss a beat. She clicked the thermometer and waited for the beep. I think your board sees numbers on a spreadsheet, but they don't see the community. That wing provides specialized geriatric care for the local population as part of its clinical trials. You close that, you lose your goodwill in the region, and your recruitment for future trials will tank. Young-soo paused, his pen hovering over a signature line. He finally looked up, his dark eyes narrowed. You read the appendix? I read everything that's left out in my workspace, she countered, meeting his gaze. And as someone who ran a clinic in a neighborhood that didn't make sense on paper, I can tell you that loyalty is a more stable currency than a one-time tax write-off. Young-soo went quiet. He didn't argue. He simply made a note in the margin of the file. For the next 2 days, the tests continued. He asked her about logistics, about human behavior, about the ethics of a new insurance algorithm. Each time, Beverly answered with a sharp, pragmatic brilliance that made him realize he hadn't just hired a nurse. He had invited a formidable strategist into his sanctuary. He was no longer just watching her as a caregiver. He was watching the way her mind worked. He noticed the way she hummed when she was thinking, the way she didn't bow to his status, and the way her presence seemed to fill the cold, empty rooms of his penthouse with a heat he hadn't felt in years. On Friday evening, a large black box embossed with the logo of a world-renowned designer appeared on Beverly's bed. Inside was a note in Yongsu's elegant, sharp script. I find I am tired of looking at blue scrubs. Dinner is at 8, in the formal dining room. Do not be late. Beverly opened the box. Nestled in layers of charcoal tissue paper was a structured floor-length gown in a deep iridescent plum, the color of a midnight sky just before the sun breaks. It was silk, heavy and luxurious, with a high neck and tailored shoulders that screamed power rather than submission. At 8 p.m., the elevator doors of the private floor opened. Yong-Soo was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed in a black velvet dinner jacket. He held a glass of mineral water, his posture rigid. He heard the soft shush of silk against the marble and turned. The air left his lungs. Beverly Farrell had transformed. The woman who usually wore sensible shoes and a stethoscope now stood before him like a queen from an ancient, forgotten empire. The plum silk draped over her curves with a devastating elegance, the deep color making her dark skin glow with a radiant, honeyed warmth. She had let her hair down, a crown of silver-streaked curls that framed a face that looked 10 years younger in the candlelight. She didn't look like his savior. She looked like his match. "You're staring, Mr. Park," Beverly said, her voice a low, vibrating silk that matched her dress. She walked toward him, the heels he had included in the box clicking with a slow, deliberate confidence. Yong-Soo didn't look away. He couldn't. The iron wall wasn't just cracking. It was dissolving into a puddle at his feet. "I am observing the results of my investment," he managed to say, though his voice was uncharacteristically thick. He stepped closer, the scent of her perfume, something warm, like vanilla and toasted spice, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he caught himself and lowered it. The tension between them was no longer the friction of two enemies. It was the heavy, ionized air before a lightning strike. "You look—" He searched for the word in English, then settled for the truth in his own language. "Aramdawo." "Beautiful?" Beverly translated softly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Dangerous," he corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. He gestured to the table, which was set with porcelain and silver, a private chef's spread waiting for them. "Tonight, there is no patient and no nurse. Only two people in a very high tower, Beverly." He pulled out her chair, his hand lingering on the back of it, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve. The touch sent a jolt of electricity up Beverly's arm that she felt in the very center of her chest. She sat, and as he took his place opposite her, the vast glittering expanse of soul at their backs, the dynamic shifted forever. They weren't fighting for control anymore. They were fighting the realization that they had both found the one thing they weren't looking for, an equal who saw through their armor. "To the stock price?" she joked, raising her glass, trying to break the intensity of his gaze. Yong-Soo didn't smile. He leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his dark eyes. "To the inconvenient woman who made me realize I was already dead before she arrived." The silence of the penthouse was usually a sanctuary, but at 3 in the morning, it felt like an empty tomb. Beverly was pulled from a deep, dreamless sleep by a sound that didn't belong in a billion-dollar fortress. It wasn't the rhythmic hum of the HVAC or the distant whistle of the wind against the Lotte Tower. It was the discordant symphony of shattering glass, followed by a heavy, muffled thud. She was out of bed before her conscious mind had fully processed the noise. Training took over. 30 years of ER instincts that didn't care about silk robes or penthouse views. She didn't grab her medical bag. She followed the sound of the ragged, animalistic gasping coming from the master suite. When she pushed open the doors, she didn't find the king of soul. The room was bathed in the ghostly blue light of the moon. Yong-Soo was on the floor beside his bed, tangled in charcoal sheets that looked like shrouds. A crystal carafe lay in glittering shards across the marble. He was convulsing, not with a seizure, but with the violent, rhythmic tremors of a man trapped in a memory. "No," he was whispering, the word a jagged tear in the quiet. "Not yet. I can't. I can't move. Help me. Yama. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point in the air that only he could see. He was back in the moment of his neurological collapse, the terrifying instant when his body had turned into a stone, when he had fallen in his office and laid undiscovered for hours, convinced he was dying alone. Yong-Su, Beverly called out, her voice firm and grounding. He didn't hear her. He was clawing at his own chest, his breath coming in high, whistling hitches. Beverly dropped to her knees in the middle of the glass shards, ignoring the sting as a small fragment nipped her palm. She didn't reach for the sedative she kept in her pocket. She knew this wasn't a medical emergency of the body. It was a mutiny of the soul. Yong-Su, look at me, she commanded, her voice dropping into a low, resonant vibration. The trauma voice that had calmed 1,000 dying men. She reached out and took his face in both of her hands. His skin was ice cold and slick with sweat. He flinched, a violent jerk of his neck, his eyes darting wildly. Listen to my voice, Beverly said, moving closer until she was in his personal space, her warmth radiating against his chilled frame. You are not in that office. You are not alone. You are in your home. My name is Beverly. Say it. He let out a strangled sob, his fingers digging into her forearms with bruising force. I can't. The dark is just shadows, Yong-Su. Focus on my hands. Feel them? She pressed her palms firmer against his cheeks, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw. Focus on the heat. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. You're safe. She began to hum, a low, wordless melody, a bluesy, soulful vibration that she used to hum to herself during the long, bloody shifts in Chicago. She pulled his head toward her, guiding him until his forehead rested against her shoulder. Breathe with me, she whispered into his hair. In for 4, out for 4. Follow my chest. Slowly, the violent racking of his shoulders began to subside. The panicked, bird-like fluttering of his heart against her collarbone slowed to a heavy, exhausted thud. The tension that had made his body as rigid as iron for days finally, mercifully, snapped. Yong-Su collapsed against her. He didn't just lean. He surrendered. His arms wrapped around her waist, his fingers clutching the fabric of her cotton pajamas, as if she were the only solid thing left in a world of water. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath warm and shaky against her skin. For the first time since she had arrived in Korea, there was no Mr. Park. There was no billionaire. There was only a man who had been lonely for 50 years, finally allowing himself to be held. Beverly wrapped her arms around him, her chin resting on the top of his head. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer clinical platitudes. She simply let him be small. She let him be broken. They stayed like that on the cold marble floor for a long time, surrounded by broken glass and moonlight. The morning brought a different kind of light, soft, golden, and strangely quiet. Beverly was in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee and toasted sourdough filling the air. She heard the soft, slow click-thud of Yong-Su's cane. When he appeared in the doorway, he was dressed in a simple navy sweater and slacks. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes permanent, but the frantic, haunted look was gone. He stopped, watching her move. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, awkward quiet of two strangers who had shared a moment of weakness. It was the thick, charged silence of two people who now knew each other's secrets. I broke a carafe, he said. His voice was low, devoid of its usual silver-edged bite. I'll deduct it from my hazard pay, Beverly replied, not looking up from the coffee she was pouring. He walked to the island, but he didn't sit in his usual spot at the head of the table. He stood near her. When she handed him his mug, their fingers brushed. In the past, he would have pulled away. This time, he let the contact linger. Beverly, he said. She looked up. Last night, you didn't call the doctor. You didn't give me the pills. He searched her eyes, his expression a complex map of gratitude and something far more terrifying. Affection. Why? Beverly set her own mug down and leaned against the counter, meeting his gaze with the steady, unblinking honesty that had been his undoing. Because you didn't need a doctor, Yong-soo. You needed a person. And because I promised I wouldn't let you fall. I meant it. Yong-soo reached out, his hand steady this time, her coming up to touch the side of her neck, right where his face had been buried hours before. His thumb traced her jawline, a touch that was purely, devastatingly elective. No one has ever stayed, he whispered. When I am like that, they only see the tiger. They never stay for the man. Then they were looking at the wrong things, she said softly. The patient/nurse barrier didn't just break. It vanished, leaving behind something raw and electric. In the quiet of the soul morning, they were no longer savior and saved. They were two people who had seen the worst of each other and decided for the first time that it was enough. Yong-soo leaned in, his forehead dropping to touch hers. It wasn't a kiss, but it was a covenant. Don't leave when the contract is over, he murmured. Beverly closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him. We'll see, Yong-soo. We'll see. The gallery was a temple of white marble and glass, hidden away in the quiet, prestigious, winding streets of Samcheong-dong. It was the kind of place where the silence cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Yong-soo stood in the center of the foyer, leaning only slightly on a charcoal cane with a silver tiger's head handle, a concession to his recovery that he turned into a fashion statement. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the regained sharpness of his silhouette. Beside him, Beverly felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. She wore a tailored cream silk suit with bronze undertones that complemented her complexion and the silver in her hair. She looked sophisticated, grounded, and entirely other, in a room filled with the porcelain-skinned elite of Seoul's upper crust. You don't have to do this, she whispered, her hand resting lightly on the crook of his elbow. She could feel the tension in his muscle. The iron was back, but it was brittle. The board knows you're alive. You don't need to prove it to the ghost in this room. It is not about the board, Beverly, Yong-soo replied, his gaze fixed forward as the heavy gallery doors opened. In this city, if you are not seen, you do not exist, and I am tired of existing in the dark. As they entered, the low hum of conversation didn't stop, but it changed frequency. It became a serrated hiss of whispers. Is that him? He looks older. And who is that? A nurse? Or did he bring his housekeeper to a Lee Ufon opening? The comments were in Korean, meant to be a barrier, but Beverly didn't need a translator to read the room. She saw the way the women looked at her, not with curiosity, but with a calculated, dismissive disdain. They looked at her age, they looked at her skin, and they looked at the way Yong-soo's hand seemed to possessively guide her through the crowd. A woman in a sharp Chanel suit, the wife of a rival logistics mogul, glided toward them. Mrs. Choi was known for a tongue that was as expensive as it was poisonous. Chairman Park, she said, her voice a tinkling bell. We were so worried. The stroke? Or was it a heart failure? It's so hard to keep track of the rumors. You look surviving. Yong-soo offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. I am more than surviving, Mrs. Choi. I am revitalized. Mrs. Choi's eyes flicked to Beverly, her lip curling in a micro-expression of revulsion. She switched to English, her accent thick and mocking. And this? Is this part of your rehabilitation? I didn't know the Hansun Group was hiring foreign help for social outings. She is quite sturdy. Is she the one who helps you walk? The insult was multi-layered. A jab at his weakness, a racist dismissal of Beverly as a laborer, and a sneer at her age. Beverly felt the familiar heat of an ER nurse's temper rising in her chest. But before she could speak, she felt Yong-soo's grip on her arm tighten. He didn't pull her back. He stepped forward, pulling her into the center of the circle that had gathered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Park Yong-soo spoke, The room became a vacuum. Mrs. Choi, he said, his English flawless and cutting, your ignorance is as outdated as your husband's quarterly earnings. This is not help. This is Beverly Farrell. He turned, looking at Beverly with an expression of such intense, public reverence that it silenced the murmurs. She is my most trusted advisor, Yong-soo announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. She is the woman who saw the flaws in my Incheon R&D strategy that my entire board missed. She is the woman who holds the authority over my schedule, my health, and my confidence. If you find her presence confusing, it is likely because you are unaccustomed to seeing a woman who possesses both a mind and a backbone. He leaned in closer to Mrs. Choi, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, and if you ever refer to her as help, again, I will ensure your husband's firm is delisted from our supply chain before the champagne in your hand loses its bubbles. Mrs. Choi turned ashen. She took a stumbling step back, her social mask shattering. Yong-soo didn't wait for an apology. He turned his back on her, dismissing the elite of Seoul with a single movement. He looked at Beverly, his eyes searching hers, the tiger softening just for her. Are you all right? He asked softly. Beverly was stunned. In Chicago, she had fought her own battles. She had never had a king draw a sword for her. She looked at the man beside her, the man she had found shivering and broken on a marble floor just days ago, and saw him using his power not to crush a rival, but to shield her dignity. I'm fine, she said, her voice a bit breathless, but you just started a corporate war for me. No, Yong-soo said, his hand sliding down to interlace his fingers with hers, right there in front of the cameras and the critics. I just reminded them that I have something they will never have. And what's that? He looked at her, at the silver in her hair, the strength in her eyes, the warmth of her hand against his, a reason to keep my heart beating. He led her deeper into the gallery, his cane clicking rhythmically on the floor. For the first time, Beverly didn't feel like a nurse or a savior. She felt like a partner. And as the elite parted like the Red Sea to let them through, she realized the melting was over. The man was no longer frozen. He was on fire. The betrayal didn't come with a scream. It came in a slim, cream-colored envelope handed over in the back of a black sedan parked in a rain-slicked alley behind the Lotta Tower. It's more than a bonus, Miss Farrell. It's a legacy, whispered Director Kang, the man who had been orchestrating the board's quiet rebellion. He slid the envelope across the leather seat. $500,000, enough to pay off the foreclosure on your clinic in Chicago twice over. All we need is a detailed medical assessment. Not a lie, just a focus on his cognitive instability and emotional volatility. Help us help the company. Beverly stared at the envelope. Back home, the Farrell Community Health Center was gasping its last breath. She could almost hear the sound of the boards being nailed over the windows of the place where she had spent 30 years of her life. You want me to sell him out, Beverly said, her voice hollow. We want you to be a professional, Kang replied. He is a liability. You are a nurse. Your first duty is to the truth, isn't it? Beverly took the envelope. She didn't say yes, but she didn't leave it on the seat. The weight of it felt like a lead sinker in the pocket of her coat as she ascended back to the penthouse. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere had changed. The iron wall had been replaced by a tentative, blossoming warmth. Yong-soo was in the kitchen, not the library, and he was actually attempting to brew tea. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. You're late, he said. It wasn't a command. It was a soft observation. I was beginning to think the soul traffic had swallowed you whole. I've made Omija cha. It's supposed to be good for the heart. Beverly felt a sharp, agonizing twist in her chest. She looked at him. This man who had gone from a monster to a man trying to learn how to care for someone. The $500,000 check in her pocket felt like a brand against her thigh. Thank you, Yong-soo, she managed to say, her voice tight. She retreated to her room to change, leaving her bag on the marble island. She needed a moment to breathe, to think, to figure out how to burn that check without burning her clinic with it. But Yong-Soo was a man of detail. He was a man who noticed when the wind shifted. When Beverly returned to the kitchen 10 minutes later, the air had turned to liquid nitrogen. The tea was sitting untouched, the steam no longer rising. Yong-Soo was standing by the island. In his hand was the cream-colored envelope. The check was out, lying flat on the cold stone surface like a dead thing. Beside it was her clinic's foreclosure notice, the paper she had been carrying like a prayer for weeks. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the check. His face was a mask of such profound, crystalline coldness that it made their first meeting look like a summer afternoon. Yong-Soo, she started, her heart dropping into her stomach. I was curious, he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. I thought perhaps you were troubled by your home. I thought I might surprise you by handling your debts myself. I went into your bag to find the name of the bank. He finally looked at her. His eyes weren't filled with the tiger's fury. They were filled with a raw, bleeding heartbreak that was 1,000 times worse. But it seems my board is more efficient than I am, he said, his voice cracking just once before he smoothed it into ice. 500,000. Is that the price of my head these days? Or is it the price of your sincerity? It's not what it looks like, Beverly said, stepping forward. I didn't take it. I haven't signed anything. They approached me and you kept it, he spat, the volume of his voice finally rising. He swept the check off the counter with a violent motion. You kept it in your pocket while you drank my tea. You let me touch your hand while you were calculating the value of my instability. I was trying to save my life's work, Yong-Soo. My clinic is everything to me. And what was I? He roared, slamming his hand against the marble. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the vast room. Was I just a difficult patient to be managed? A project? A payday? The enemy's vibe returned, but it wasn't the petty bickering of the first week. This was the war of two people who had let their guards down and been stabbed for the effort. Yong-Soo stepped toward her, his stature towering, his presence once again looming and lethal. He looked at her, not as his savior, but as the ultimate traitor. I should have known, he hissed, his face inches from hers. A man like me is never loved. He is only leased. You are no different than the nurses who cried, Beverly. You're just more expensive. Don't you dare, Beverly whispered, her eyes filling with hot, angry tears. Don't you dare turn me into a villain because you're too scared to believe someone could actually care about you. Get out, he said. The words were flat, dead. Yong-Soo, get out of this room. Get out of my sight. He turned his back on her, grabbing the edge of the sink so hard his knuckles turned white. The tremor in his hand was back, more violent than ever. Your contract is still active. I cannot fire you without the board's interference, so you will stay in your wing. You will perform your clinical duties, but do not speak to me. Do not look at me. From this moment on, you are nothing but a ghost in this house. Beverly stood frozen. The man she had started to love had just retreated behind a wall thicker than any he had built before. She picked up the foreclosure notice, leaving the board's check on the floor where it had fallen. She walked out of the kitchen, each step feeling like she was walking over broken glass. The iron wall was back, and this time, Beverly wasn't sure if she had the strength to break it down again. The air in the Hansung Group's private executive lounge was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and impending doom. Director Kang and two other board members sat across from Yong-Soo, their faces masks of sympathetic concern that didn't quite hide the hunger in their eyes. Yong-Soo sat at the head of the table, his face a granite carving. He looked every bit the emperor, but Beverly, standing in the shadows by the door, saw the slight tremor in his left hand that he was hiding beneath the mahogany surface. The medical report, Miss Farrell? Kang asked, leaning forward. We have the documents ready for your signature. The special bonus is ready for wire transfer the moment we conclude this. Yong-Soo didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set so tight it looked ready to shatter. He was waiting for the final blow. He was waiting for her to confirm his deepest fear, that everyone, even the woman who had held him through a night terror, had a price. Beverly stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. She was wearing a sharp charcoal gray blazer and slacks. She looked like a woman who was done being a pawn. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood and hit Director Kang's coffee cup with a sharp clack. "I believe this belongs to you," Beverly said, her voice echoing with a terrifying clarity. Kang blinked, his composure faltering. "Ms. Farrell, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Director," she interrupted. "I've spent 30 years in the ER. I know a parasite when I see one. You didn't want a medical assessment. You wanted a weapon. And you thought that because I have bills to pay, I'd be willing to pull the trigger for you." She turned to Yong-Soo. For the first time in 48 hours, she forced him to meet her eyes. "I'm quitting," Beverly announced. The room gasped, but she kept her gaze locked on the man at the head of the table. "I'm terminating my contract with the Hansung Group effective immediately. I don't work for vultures." Yong-Soo's mask finally cracked. His eyes widened, a flicker of raw, confused hope sparking in the darkness. "Beverly, however," she continued, turning back to the board, "I'm not leaving the penthouse. As of 10 minutes ago, I've accepted a position as Mr. Park's personal guest. If you want to get to him, you'll have to go through me, and I promise you I'm much harder to bribe when I'm not on the clock." "You can't do this." Kong stood up, his face reddening. "This is a breach of—" "Call the police, then," Beverly challenged, leaning over the table. "I'd love to explain to the authorities and the press exactly what was in that envelope and why you were offering it to the chairman's private nurse." The silence that followed was absolute. Kang looked at the check, then at Yong-Soo's darkening expression, and realized he had lost. The vultures gathered their things and retreated, scurrying out of the room like rats fleeing a flooding basement. The penthouse was quiet again, the late afternoon sun casting long, amber shadows across the floor. Yong-Soo stood by the window, his back to the room. Beverly was at the island, packing her medical kit into her bag. She had kept her word. She had moved her things out of the staff wing and into a guest room. "Why?" The word was a mere breath. Yong-Soo turned around. He looked diminished, his pride stripped away, leaving only the man who had been saved. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. "I said such things to you. I compared you to everyone else." "You did," Beverly said, her voice steady but weary. "You were a jerk, Yong-Soo. A world-class, billionaire-grade jerk." He took a step toward her, then another. The cane clicked on the marble, a rhythmic heartbeat. "I have lived my life assuming that everyone is an enemy until they prove they are a servant. I didn't know how to see you. I was afraid." "Of me?" "Of needing you," he admitted, stopping a foot away from her. The iron wall wasn't just gone. The ground it stood on had been washed away. He looked at her dark, beautiful face, the wisdom in her eyes, and the strength that had protected him when he couldn't protect himself. "The board is gone. The contract is over. You have no reason to stay in this cold house with a man who treated you like a traitor." Beverly zipped her bag. "I told you, I don't like bullies, and I don't leave my friends in a vulture's nest." "Is that all we are? Friends?" He reached out, his hand trembling, not from his illness this time, but from the sheer weight of what he was about to ask. He tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his touch lingering against her temple. "Stay," he whispered. "Not for the clinic, not for the contract, not because I'm a patient." He closed his eyes for a second, his voice breaking. "Stay because I don't know how to be this man without you. Stay for me." Beverly felt the last of her own defenses crumble. She looked at this powerful, complicated man who was offering her the one thing he had never given anyone, his heart, completely unarmored. "I'm a very expensive guest, Yong-Soo," she teased softly. her voice thick with emotion. I will give you the world, he vowed. Just don't leave me in the dark. He didn't wait for her to answer. He reached out, his hands framing her face, and pulled her toward him. The kiss wasn't the tentative, gentle thing of a movie. It was intense, beautiful, and fueled by weeks of suppressed longing and battlefield adrenaline. It was the collision of two people who had spent 50 years building fortresses, finally realizing they wanted to be conquered. Yong-Su tasted of tea and salt, and a hunger that went deeper than the physical. His fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her flush against him, his body finally finding its anchor. Beverly wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him with a fierce, possessive strength, meeting his fire with her own. When they finally pulled apart, the air between them was electric. The inconvenient savior had become something else entirely. Yong-Su rested his forehead against hers, his eyes dark with a heat that promised she wouldn't be sleeping in the guest room tonight. I think, he murmured against her lips, my blood pressure is rising again. Beverly smiled, a radiant, triumphant glow. Don't worry, Mr. Park. I'm not going anywhere. The golden glow of their new union was shattered by a reminder of mortality. It happened in the early hours of the morning. Yong-Su had tried to stand, but the room had tilted violently. When Beverly found him, he wasn't throwing vases or shouting commands. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trembling with a silent, terrifying fragility. The setback was a transient ischemic attack, a warning shot from a body that had been pushed too hard by corporate wars and emotional upheavals. But this time, the tiger didn't roar. When Beverly helped him back onto the pillows, her professional mask firmly in place despite her racing heart, he looked at her with an expression that broke her more than his cruelty ever had. It was fear, not the fear of pain, but the fear of time. I finally found the sun, he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power. And now, the clouds are closing in. The clouds are passing, Yong-Su, Beverly said, her voice a steady anchor. I told you, I'm not letting you fall. For the next 3 days, the penthouse became a sanctuary of quiet, radical intimacy. There were no nurses, no staff, and no board members. There was only the woman who had seen his soul and the man who was finally learning to let it be seen. The second evening, Beverly prepared a bath. The master bathroom was a cavern of black granite and cedar wood, the air thick with the scent of hinoki and steam. In the past, Yong-Su would have died before letting someone see him so exposed. But as Beverly helped him out of his silk robe, he leaned into her, his hand resting on her shoulder for support. She moved with a slow, reverent grace, her touch neither clinical nor voyeuristic, but profoundly tender. She helped him into the deep, steaming water. As he settled against the cedar backrest, his eyes closed in relief. Beverly knelt on the black tile beside the tub, dipped a soft cloth into the water, and began to wash him. The contrast was a living painting, her deep, rich cocoa skin against the pale, scarred marble of his chest. She moved the cloth over his shoulders, over the surgical scars on his side, and down the powerful line of his arms. When I was 20, Yong-Su said, his eyes still closed, I thought my body was a machine. I thought if I worked it hard enough, it would never fail me. I thought strength was the absence of need. Beverly squeezed the cloth, warm water cascading over his skin like a benediction. And now? He opened his eyes, looking at her with a clarity that was devastating. Now I realized that the greatest strength I ever had was the day I finally let you catch me. He reached out a wet hand, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. Beverly leaned into his palm, a silent tear escaping and losing itself in the steam. You've spent 50 years being a fortress, Yong-Su, she whispered. It's okay to just be the land for a while. Later that night, the rain drummed a rhythmic lullaby against the glass. They lay in the center of the massive bed, not as lovers in a frantic heat, but as partners in a long-awaited peace. Beverly sat propped against the pillows, a book of Langston Hughes poetry in her lap. Yong-Su lay with his head in her lap, his obsidian hair fanned out against her thighs. She read to him, her voice a low, soulful hum that filled the room. To sit and dream, to sit and read, to sit and learn about the world. Between the poems, the stories came out, the ones that didn't make it into the files. Beverly talked about the South Side of Chicago, about the aunties who had raised her on porches with sweet tea and the hard-earned wisdom of survival. She talked about the first time she lost a patient and how she had sat in her car and cried until the sun came up, realizing that her heart was both her greatest asset and her heaviest burden. Yong-Su talked about the silence of his ascent. He spoke of the years he spent in cold offices, surrounded by friends who only wanted his signature and lovers who only wanted his name. "We are the same, you and I," he said, his hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers. "Two lonely peaks. We climbed so high so no one could touch us, only to find that the air at the top is too thin to breathe." "But look where we are now," Beverly said, looking around the room that no longer felt like a gilded cage. "We're not on the peaks anymore." "No," Yong-Su murmured, his eyes drifting shut as he succumbed to a healing, natural sleep. "We found the valley, and the valley is warm." Beverly watched him sleep, the rise and fall of his chest a miracle she had been hired to protect and had stayed to love. She realized then that their age wasn't a deficit. It was their superpower. They didn't have the frantic, shallow passion of youth. They had the deep, subterranean connection of two souls who had waited half a century to finally be understood. She closed the book and turned off the lamp, the Seoul skyline shimmering outside like a sea of fallen stars. For the first time in her life, Beverly Farrell wasn't thinking about the next shift, the next crisis, or the next bill. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The final assault didn't come with a boardroom vote. It came with a knock at the penthouse door and a pair of men in gray suits carrying federal warrants. "Ms. Beverly Farrell?" the lead officer asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your visa has been flagged for immediate revocation. There are allegations of unauthorized medical practice and undue influence over a vulnerable Korean citizen. You have 2 hours to pack your things for deportation." Beverly felt the blood drain from her face. She looked past the men toward the hallway, where Jin-Ho, Yong-Su's brother-in-law, stood leaning against the marble wall with a triumphant smirk. "I told you, foreigner," Jin-Ho called out. "You don't belong in this tower. You're a stain on this family's reputation." Beverly's hands shook not with fear, but with a righteous burning fury. Before she could speak, a door clicked open behind her. Yong-Su emerged. He was pale, leaning heavily on his silver-topped cane, his silk robe hanging slightly loose on his frame. But his eyes, the eyes that had softened only for Beverly, were once again 2 chips of obsidian, cold enough to freeze the air in the room. "Get out," Yong-Su said. The officers hesitated. "Chairman Park, we have a signed affidavit from your family." "I am the only family that matters in this house," Yong-Su hissed, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. He turned his gaze to Jin-Ho. "And you think because I stayed in bed for a few weeks that I have forgotten how to crush a viper? You haven't just attacked my guest. You have attacked my heart. I will see you in the boardroom in 1 hour. If you're late, I'll have security drag you there in front of the press." The Hansung Group headquarters was a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the Seoul sky. In the grand boardroom on the top floor, the air was suffocating. The directors sat in high-backed leather chairs, whispering about the incapacitated king and the American woman who had supposedly bewitched him. Jin-Ho sat at the head of the table. Thinking the chairman was bluffing, "He is unable to attend. We will move to the final vote for his removal based on cognitive decline." The double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were nearly thrown off their hinges. The room went silent. Yong-Su marched in. He wasn't in a robe or a sweater. He was in a black 3-piece suit, tailored to such lethal perfection that he looked like a god of war returning from the brink. He walked with a slight limp, his cane hitting the floor with a rhythmic, intimidating thud, but he didn't look weak. And on his arm, dressed in the iridescent plum silk gown from their first dinner, was Beverly. She walked with her chin high, her hand resting on his sleeve, not as a support, but as a throne. The reports of my decline have been greatly exaggerated, Yong-Soo announced, his voice booming through the silent room. He didn't take his seat. He stood at the head of the table, towering over Jin-Ho. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a digital tablet, sliding it across the table with a cold, dismissive flick. That is the recorded evidence of Director Kang and Vice Chairman Jin-Ho attempting to bribe a medical professional to falsify records, Yong-Soo said. It includes the wire transfer IDs and the recorded conversation from the back of a sedan. If a single word about deportation or mental instability is breathed again, this goes to the Blue House and every news agency in Asia. Jin-Ho went white, his hand trembling as he reached for the tablet. But I'm not here just to purge the dead weight, Yong-Soo continued. He turned, looking at Beverly, his expression softening just enough for the directors to see a man who was finally, truly alive. Hansung Group has spent 50 years looking inward, he said to the board. We have been a fortress, but fortresses eventually crumble. Growth requires new blood, new visions. Therefore, I am announcing the Hansung Global Health Initiative. A murmur went through the room. We are moving our primary pharmaceutical R&D operations and our new geriatric care pilot program to Chicago, Yong-Soo declared, specifically to the South Side. We are entering into a permanent partnership with the Farrell Community Health Center. We will be funding its expansion into a state-of-the-art regional hospital. Beverly gasped, her hand tightening on his arm. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. He hadn't told her. He had done the one thing she never thought a man like him could do. He had used his empire to protect her legacy. This is not a charity, Yong-Soo said, his voice regaining its steel as he looked back at the board. It is a strategic foothold in the Western market. And since no one understands that market, or the human heart, better than she does, Beverly Farrell will be the executive consultant for the entire project. He looked at Jin-Ho, who was staring at him in stunned defeat. Now, pack your things, Jin-Ho. You're fired. I believe there's an opening for a seaweed stall in Guangzhou Market if you're looking for work. The boardroom cleared out in a flurry of panicked directors and scurrying lawyers. For the first time, they were alone in the massive glass room, the city of Seoul spread out beneath them like a map of their future. Yong-Soo leaned against the table, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading, leaving him a little breathless. Beverly stepped into his space, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. The clinic, the move, it's too much, Yong-Soo. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her lips. The iron wall was gone, replaced by a man who had finally found his home. I spent decades building a kingdom I didn't want to live in, he said softly. What is an empire if I have to stand in it alone? I'm not just saving your clinic, Beverly. I'm making sure that wherever you go, I am right there beside you. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. I am a difficult man, he murmured, and I am a patient who doesn't follow orders. Are you sure you want to handle me for the rest of your life? Beverly smiled, a radiant, beautiful expression that lit up the entire room. She leaned up, her lips brushing his. I've handled trauma bays, gangsters, and billionaire vipers, Yong-Soo. I think I can handle one stubborn tiger. The kiss that followed was no longer a desperate plea. It was a victory. It was the sound of a wall falling and the beginning of a life where the inconvenient savior and the cold hero finally became one. Spring in Seoul arrived not with a whisper, but with a riot of cherry blossoms. The white and pink petals drifted through the canyons of Gangnam, coating the black sedans and glass towers in a layer of soft, fragile life. In the penthouse, the air had changed. The sterile, metallic chill of winter was gone, replaced by the scent of open windows and the steady, rhythmic hum of a life being rebuilt. Beverly Farrell stood in the center of the master suite, her suitcase open on the bed. Her formal contract with the Hansung Group lay on the bedside table, stamped with a final, red terminated seal. Legally, her duty was done. She was no longer a hired savior. She was no longer a line item in a corporate budget. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Yong-Soo leaned his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. His tremor was gone, his strength returned, but the way he held her was different now. It wasn't a grip of desperation, but one of absolute, unwavering belonging. "The plane is ready," he murmured. "Are you sure you want to go back? I could buy the street. I could buy the neighborhood. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." Beverly turned in his arms, looping her hands around his neck. She looked at the man who had once tried to fire her with a snarl, and now looked at her as if she were the North Star. "I don't want you to buy it, Yong-Soo," she said, her voice a low, fond velvet. "I want you to see it. I want you to see the world that made me. And besides, someone has to keep you in line in Chicago. The nurses there won't be as patient as I was." Yong-Soo smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Then I suppose I have no choice. I've become quite accustomed to your lack of patience." 2 months later. Chicago, Illinois. The South Side was a different kind of jungle than Seoul. It was a place of brick and iron, of jazz spilling out of basement windows, and the scent of street vendors and summer rain. The Farrell Park Community Health Center stood as a beacon of polished stone and shimmering glass amidst the grit of the neighborhood. It was the most advanced medical facility in the city, but it still had the soul of the clinic Beverly's family had started 50 years ago. Inside the bustling waiting room, a man sat in a sleek, ergonomic chair that looked vastly more expensive than anything else in the building. Park Yong-Soo, dressed in a charcoal designer suit that probably cost more than the ambulance parked outside, was scowling at a small paper cup of lukewarm coffee. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to no one in particular. "The acidity is offensive. Beverly, why is there no proper tea in this wing?" Beverly emerged from an exam room, her white coat open, her stethoscope around her neck. She looked vibrant, her skin glowing under the Chicago sun, her presence commanding and calm. She stopped in front of him, hands on her hips, a smirk playing on her lips. "Mr. Park," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, doctor-in-charge authority. "You are currently a guest in a community clinic. If you want high mountain oolong, you can walk 2 blocks to the shop you bought for me last week. Otherwise, sit there, be quiet, and wait for me to finish my rounds." A few of the regular patients, older Black women who had known Beverly since she was a girl, snickered in the corner. "He's a handful, Bev," one of them called out. "You sure you don't want to trade him in for a quieter model?" Yong-Soo looked at the woman, his eyes flashing with that old billionaire ice for a split second before he caught Beverly's warning look. He sighed, leaning back in the chair, and took another sip of the offensive coffee. "She wouldn't dare," Yong-Soo grumbled, though his eyes followed Beverly as she moved through the clinic. He watched her with a pride so thick it was palpable. He was a billionaire in a plastic chair, a tiger in a neighborhood that didn't know his name, and he had never been happier. As the sun began to dip below the Chicago skyline, painting the brick buildings in hues of deep orange and gold, Beverly and Yong-Soo walked out of the clinic together. They didn't head for the black SUV idling at the curb. Instead, they walked down the sidewalk, their shoulders brushing. Yong-Soo didn't use his cane today. He walked with a steady, measured gait, his hand finding Beverly's and interlacing their fingers. They were a striking pair, the elegant, silver-haired Korean titan and the powerful, radiant Black doctor. They were two people who had already lived entire lifetimes, who had built empires and saved lives. And yet, as they walked through the vibrant, noisy street, they looked like teenagers at the start of a long summer. "You're thinking about the board meeting tomorrow," Beverly said, glancing at him. I am thinking, Yongsu corrected, pulling her slightly closer, that I spent 50 years waiting for my life to begin. I wasted a lot of time being important, Beverly. Well, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they crossed the street toward the park. We're 50 now. We've got at least 30 more years of being unimportant together. Think you can handle the boredom? Yongsu stopped, turning her to face him under the glow of a street lamp. He looked at the woman who had invaded his fortress, disarmed his anger, and given him back his heart. He leaned down, his kiss tasting of the city and the future. With you, Beverly Farrell, he whispered against her lips, nothing is ever boring. They continued their walk, disappearing into the shadows of the park, two powerful souls who had found their second act in the most inconvenient, beautiful love of all. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.